Hi, I'm Sungyeon Lee. I currently teach at Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary in Indiana as an assistant professor of pastoral theology and psychology. I am excited to have this opportunity to discuss this mature communal empathy in the face of gender-based violence in this video from developmental psychology and feminist care ethics perspectives. This presentation is actually based on my recent book, The Power of Mature Empathy in Response to Sexual Violence in Faith Communities. In this book, I explored how empathy can be utilized as a resource for moral action, especially in providing care for the marginalized, particularly when empathic development is in an immature stage. The moral weaknesses of empathy can be more easily realized and be manifested in a harmful way for the marginalized, including the victim survivors of gender-based violence. Therefore, I conceptualize mature empathy as a form of resistance that can serve as a powerful moral resource for solidarity, justice-seeking actions, and spiritual care for the marginalized. When mature empathy is promoted and shapes the community, mature communal empathy can work in a very powerful way and can be a great communal resource to promote justice and peace. By looking into the stories of sexual violence in faith communities, I explored in this book the responses from the faith communities and digital venues to the victim survivors and how empathy was actually actualized in this process. I also drew on gender-based violence in immigration detention center in the US to show how systematically gender-based violence was induced and the offenders protected in that system. There are groups of people who are most vulnerable and marginalized even among the marginalized groups, and those stories do not get out easily to be heard and shared. The stories of asylum seekers and undocumented immigrants are one of those. Through these stories, I wanted to shed light on the stories that are hardly heard even in the Me Too movement, as storytelling can also be a great way of resistance that can facilitate empathic response. The starting point for this book was out of one question, which you can see in the slide. What is the most altruistic, effective moral faculty to draw out the participation of the passive bystanders in empowering the marginalized? There are various answers to these questions. Empathy is one of the primary answers as it is considered to be the glue that holds communities together. While there are there may be some critiques of this statement, um, um, that it is mostly, but it is mostly acknowledged that empathy is a truly pro-social affect that humans hold because of the nature of empathy, which involves cognitive and affective abilities that are hardwired in human beings. It is psychologically and scientifically proven that many animals, including humans, are hardwired to empathize with other beings. And it will probably be safe to say that almost no living creature can survive if there were no empathy for the baby, the most vulnerable stage of the life course of each creature. Of course, empathy is not a panacea. Empathy has its own moral weaknesses and strengths, especially when it is used for morally very nuanced situations. That's why Oxley, a feminist philosopher and moral psychologist, stated that empathy can be part of the story of morality, but by no means the whole of it. Empathy, I define, is an inner response. It's not an action, but it's an inner response as a result of feelings and thought processes, and it does not necessarily lead to empathic action. Additionally, even when action is taken based on empathy, it can be manifested in either a moral or immoral way. The way empathy is aroused and actualized is so complicated that it's not possible to explain the complex mechanisms in this short presentation, of course. The question for us here then is how we can evoke mature empathy, more developed form of empathy in an empowering and caring manner for the marginalized during our moral encounters. You probably heard several stories in which faith communities were dysfunctional and harmful and even re-victimizing re-victimizing the victim survivors of sexual violence as they responded to them. It is also quite a contrasting reaction from faith communities and digital space formed by the Me Too movement. Why was empathy actualized in the way that the community harmed victim survivors and protected the offenders? How did that virtual community formed by the Me Too movement provide empathy-based care and support to victim survivors while they are distant others, the complete strangers? In the meantime, our own faith communities react and re-victimize and harm those people. It is because empathy is often manipulated by the gatekeepers of the institutionalized community who hoard power over the system. Manipulated empathy, along with other features, is a typical manifestation of immature empathy. When the community's foundational cultural and ethical practices are undergirded by immature empathy, the community cannot provide proper spiritual care for the marginalized group, specifically the victim survivors of gender-based violence. Since gender-based violence directly impacts people's identity, the sense of self-worth, self-esteem, and their meaning and belief systems, it is the most vulnerable time for them in the aftermath of such violence, in which they need the most support and care from their community. Unfortunately, it's not uncommon to hear the stories that faith communities empathize with the perpetrators and force the victim survivors to remain silent. The manifestation of empathy in moral situations may vary depending on the developmental stage of one's empathic ability, encompassing both cognitive and affective empathy. Here, many factors play a part, such as socioethical awareness level, cultural competency level, one's level of psychosocial and moral development, and the intensity of distress cues like that arouses the empathy, and racial, family, educational, communal, and family backgrounds, just to name a few, that all these different factors play a part. And this means that empathy's maturity level is an essential factor that determines if empathy is manifested as the justice-making and peace-building thoughts, feelings, and action. So what is mature empathy? The word mature connotes a normative nuance. Being morally and mentally mature is what we pursue as it implies a paramount mental state of a person. In this vein, mature empathy involves a normative disposition as it constantly guides us to who we ought to be and what we ought to do. So therefore, identifying the psychologically and morally mature state of an individual implies the developmental direction that we are constantly seeking. This state is what we are developing into so as to be personally, morally, socially, and communally a better person, a better moral agent. Maturity then involves perspectives and embeddedness as it refers us to what's better and what's right in and for the society. Therefore, society or a shared notion of the common good guides us and shapes how we define maturity. On the other hand, as members of society, we can also construct a mature society and community by imagining the morality and endeavoring to realize that morality. So again, this mature empathy is explained in a way that in a normative nuance. So in this sense, I identified the features of mature empathy based on the social imaginary of an empathetic, just, and caring society. I outlined 6 different features of mature empathy in my book, and these 3 key characteristics can be highlighted. First, mature empathy holds on to balanced justice and care principles, not just justice, not just care, both of them together as complementary relationship. As it helps the moral agent to understand the state of the other and the world in a more balanced view. Secondly, the mature empathy is founded on the inner subjective understanding of self, other, and the world. And also third, mature empathy is equipped with the ability to utilize interdimensional perspective taking. This concept will be explained later in this presentation. Therefore, mature empathizers can provide caring justice and just care since they have developed more principles of justice and care. Thus, they do not easily get biased in empathic moral deliberation. They also have capability to voluntarily embrace the distant other's cries and vulnerability as they understand that they are not able to live without other fellow human and non-human beings as an inner subjective being. Lastly, because they are capable of interdimensional perspective taking, they can expand the scope of their caring circle based on their empathy from their significant others to distant others. Therefore, they will be able to overcome that parochial care system. So based on this mature empathy as a normative moral faculty, I will provide 3 suggestions for spiritual care practices for the victim survivors and other marginalized groups of people. First is to maximize empathy-based affects guided by mature empathy, which needs to be underlined as we practice spiritual care as resistance. Since we don't have enough time to go through each of these, I will touch on empathic anger only in this presentation. Empathic anger means you are angry on behalf of the other due to the injustice done to that person or the difficult situation that the other person is in. For the marginalized groups or gender-based violence victim survivors, because they're often vulnerable to social injustice and become easily the target of the perpetrators because there's no social security net for them. There's lack of that or absence even of that. Spiritual care providers verbal and nonverbal expressions of empathic anger for them can significantly reduce the distress of that care seekers. Of course, each of these affects needs to be guided by mature empathy, otherwise the affect itself may not be used in a morally helpful manner. When anger by itself becomes the care provider's own anger, instead of only for the sake of the care seeker, there may be a psychological dysfunction of that anger, and it will not be considered as an empathy-based anger. The second suggestion is to practice interdimensional perspective taking along with other perspective taking skills. One of the most important tools that we can use to facilitate mature empathy, I argue, is interdimensional perspective taking. Perspective taking is one of the important cognitive ability empathy brings in. To simply put it, we basically take somebody else's perspective to see and feel the experience or reality of the other. Self-oriented perspective taking is to imagine what I would do if I were in that situation that the other person is in right now. Other-oriented perspective taking is to imagine what it would feel like if I went through all the same experiences that the other person went through, and I become her, the other person who is very different than who I am. And how would I, as the other person, feel about that situation? So this is other-oriented perspective taking. Dual perspective taking is easily imaginably using both self and other-oriented perspective taking. In addition to these three existing perspective taking skills that exist in the scholarship, I added interdimensional perspective taking. It is what I conceptualized in my book, that highly cognizant humans can go beyond that dyadic empathizing process through perspective taking, not just me, self, and the other, but interdimensionally utilizing our relational network and resources coming out of it. We can utilize what we have learned from all other resources in our network as we try to imagine other people's perspectives. For example, a Mexican American woman saw an elderly Asian couple being attacked by a white guy who was over 6 foot during the COVID pandemic. She can try to use self-oriented perspective taking, and she can think, if I were in that situation, I would have been very scared as a racial minority. And then using other-oriented perspective taking, she can move further and think, if I were that elderly Asian couple, as they are, and I wasn't able to express myself due to a language barrier like they are, I would have been terrified, frustrated that I can't really express myself, and mad and scared at the same time. I would have been so desperate for help from the passive bystanders. She goes further by utilizing interdimensional perspective taking, and she thinks, my sister-in-law actually is an Asian immigrant like them, and I remember she said she was afraid of being the target of Asian hate crimes these days. If it were her who was being attacked like that, using the sister-in-law's perspective, she probably I would have been, as her, I would have been so mad, and I would take action definitely. Interdimensional perspective taking can help the empathizer utilize all the resources that one has gathered in their lifetime and employ their newly gathered knowledge as their own perspectives. News articles, stories one read, the empathizer read in visual venues, friends and families' perspectives, books and media can all become their resources for the third perspective to take, which I call supplementary perspective. As it is evident, it takes extreme effort to utilize and develop interdimensional perspective taking skills based on mature empathy. But if you can actually utilize interdimensional perspective taking with the help of supplementary perspective taking, our caring circle and empathizing skills will be very much broadened and extended. This skill is especially important for us to go beyond our own caring circle, very parochial, very narrow, very personally related kind of caring circle, expand that towards distant others who we've never met before. There are multiple ways to provoke empathic ability, and one of them is storytelling as well. This is the last suggestion I make in this video. Exposing one's story is one of the most effective ways to draw out empathy, as it can help us provide just care for the marginalized. Additionally, empathy evoking storytelling can be a powerful tool as we strive to achieve caring justice for the perpetrators. In this way, in seeking to find and share the stories of the marginalized by itself is a resistance through which bystanders can possibly become proactive moral participants in providing care for the victim survivors of the gender-based violence. I call for envisioning the community of mature empathy as I wrap up this video presentation. In other words, a call for a social imaginary of an empathic, just, and caring society. Because this kind of society and community has never been achieved, realized in our life in this world, the imagination itself can be a resistance against all the violence and abuse through which people constantly become marginalized. I hope you can try to apply the three suggestions when you provide the care, spiritual care for others, as we continually strive to build a community of justice and care. This is it. This is it. Thank you for watching this presentation and have a wonderful week. Thank you. Bye-bye.